Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Morning Shot. And with me in the audience today, I've got the esteemed Mark Oppenheimer with his beautiful Jesus locks. Make a comment down below. How many of you thinks he's got Jesus locks? Welcome to the show, Mark. Lovely to have you back.
Absolute pleasure. I love being here.
Absolutely. So let's get straight into the conversation. We already started the conversation. So obviously the rest of the audience is like, oh, what's this all about? So we're talking about the Charlie Kirk assassination, which I must be honest, I made a lot of videos on it. I covered the entire thing from the day that he got assassinated to what was the left and the online reaction. Also, look, I also covered from the right, so I covered all the comments that Ben Shapiro made and all those kind of like the homages to Charlie Kirk. I covered the events surrounding his capture and also the post events. So that's obviously the left all celebrating his death. So we were talking about free speech. So let's actually start off with that angle, and let's pick up where I've left off in terms of my videos, and that is the left being cancelled for critiquing Charlie.
Yeah, I suppose, one of the things that Charlie was so good at doing was having an open conversation with his opponents and providing them with a massive platform to express a dissenting view. And it seems like one way to celebrate Charlie is to celebrate that, which means allowing both sides to have their say in a way that is nonviolent. Now, some of the reactions to Charlie's assassination are either very vulgar or call on others to be killed. So immediately afterwards, you had people saying like Ben Shapiro should be next, or Charlie Kirk is a racist fascist who had it coming. And so there's an interesting question about, are there some kinds of speech where you're no longer in the realm of expressing an opinion, but you're in the realm of calling for an action? So Greg Lukianoff at FIRE says that he is not a free speech absolutist, but he's an opinion absolutist. So, if you want to take one view on the existence of God or on abortion or the death penalty, he's like, have at it, no problem. But if you are calling for people to be killed and inciting violence, it's not clear that there's necessarily an opinion worthy of protection there. And there's a real risk that someone's going to get hurt, especially, in the aftermath of violence. You can often have a sort of fever that gets created where people sort of feel like it's okay to keep doing this because we're on the side of the righteous. One of the people I thought was very good at calming things down was Ben Shapiro. So himself having received death threats and having a very close relationship with Charlie and having done the campus tour thing since he was very young, it's a very personal question. And the first thing he said was, they didn't kill Charlie. An individual killed Charlie. We must be very wary of blaming the group and of, we must do this thing to them.
Ben would say that though, because there's this idea, as you know, that Jews killed Christ, and Jews were collectively barred with the death of Christ. Ergo, they've all suffered as a result of it over the centuries. So Ben is acutely aware of what it means to target a group as opposed to an individual.
Yes, and if you go back to some of the violence in Kristallnacht, one of the reasons that was given by the Nazis was that a Jewish person had shot a Nazi official. And so they said, we need to do something about them. And so they went and destroyed synagogues and Jewish shops all around the country. So, yeah, Ben is, I would think, drawing on Jewish history to sort of say there's something very dangerous about scapegoating a group because of an individual. Now, I suppose
I'll take a slightly different approach to his, and that is, it's a topic that I think you yourself might want to even explore in your own podcast. But one of the big problems I see in the West is that the West is framed on classical liberalism, right? As you know, classical liberalism. But how many people actually have had a classical liberal education? So there's this idea that we live in a democratic society, but how many people have ever read the works of, Voltaire, Marcuse, John Locke? Like, how many of them have read anything by Madison or why Madison drafted the First Amendment in the way that he did? Right, and Madison himself was a Lockean. So we have to remember that John Locke himself advocated for something very specific. He says that there was this degree where you would have, religious tolerance, but there would be limits on the government's authority in order to how it would perceive that. Though you could then say that the policing of speech would be progressive beyond that. So I want to kind of like, I'm not explaining it that well to the untrained, but I will. And the idea was further extrapolated in Voltaire. As you know, he says, I disapprove of what you have to say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. The idea being that you have policing by the state and you have policing by the public. And there's a fundamental difference between these two. The state, in terms of a classical liberal idea, has zero right on the regulation of speech, unless it's for the purposes of preventing harm. But remember that preventing harm is specifically saying, hey guys, let's all go kill that guy over there, like then the state. But that's usually linked to something else, like incitement of violence or conspiracy to do something. It's not just, oh, you said naughty words that hurt my feelings. The idea of what you call now the modern hate speech. But then outside of that, the idea was that there should be public policing of what you say. In other words, if you say something that I find deeply offensive, I'll defend your right to say it, but then I'm going to tell you why you should shut up and go do one and why you're wrong, which is where we always got the idea of the battle of ideas. That's where that came from, right? So we'd have this public discourse, we'd have, public debate, and outside of that, we could maybe come to a consensus. But that's not what happens now. What happens now is that the state have entered into the purview of actually policing that rhetoric. They the ones who are deciding what is harm. Because now, as you know, words of violence, ergo anything you could say could theoretically be violence. Ergo the state have to restrict what you say because I might be offended by it and that might be violence. So this idea of having this discourse is, well, it's gone. And that's effectively why Charlie died, right? Because Charlie was trying to have a classical kind of liberal type discussion. And those that didn't like it perceived it as being violent. And so they thought it was as being justified to react in self-defense. In other words, let's silence Charlie, let's shoot him. Because that's legit. Because he was harming me, so I harmed him back. I silenced him. And that is fundamentally what the issue is, isn't it?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. So you're right. There's a huge danger in equating words with violence. And there, as I said, I was praising Shapiro for saying they didn't kill Charlie, but there are certain ideas that create an environment that enable that. And Shapiro talks about that as well, that you sort of have, permission enabling language. So when you say things like words are violence, well, the way that you deal with violence is, with real violence. And it's just an act of self-defense, really. So that's very dangerous. And so it's very important to be able to draw the distinction between words and deeds. There's an interesting question to say about should the state have any role whatsoever in policing speech? The American First Amendment is very strong. But even then, there are certain things that you can be held liable for. So, defamation, perjury, ordering a hit on your wife, that's going to be, a speech act. Someone else pulls the trigger. So we all accept that there's some kind of limitation. The limitation that's sort of the general one there is the incitement of it's lawless action, imminent lawless action. So if you're calling on people to perform a crime, but not just now, kind of now. So I suppose the question is, and then you mentioned just because the state has a restricted purview doesn't mean that the rest of us don't have a role to play in dealing with bad speech. And that is the idea of the marketplace of ideas, that we, say, well, I disagree with you, and here's my reasons why, and here's why that idea is a bad idea, and that you hope you win in the arena of ideas. I mean, John Stuart Mill said you've got to be worried about the tyranny of the majority. So there might be certain ideas that are true, that are unpopular, and very hard to say because of the social sanctions. And so the idea is you should have a bit of a culture of free speech where you think people should be allowed to express the unutterable and not even get social sanction for it. And it used to be, I think, the case that on university campuses, the idea was, well, this is going to be a place where you can play with weird and wonderful ideas. It's a bit of a sandpit, and you can say something that's going to be a little bit strange, but you're not going to get drummed out of the university for it. Now, I think universities are probably the least tolerating places. I think they have a crazy level of orthodoxy. I was looking, just as an example, at the University of Cape Town's got a seminar series in the education department, and Jeremy Corbyn will be one of the star speakers on Palestine, as will every other speaker for the next 3 months. There is not another topic that is not on Palestine, and there are no topics there on the formation of the Israeli state or why Zionism is a perfectly acceptable practice. Like, there is one orthodoxy there. I say this as a member of UCT's council, and I don't speak on behalf of the university, but when I see things like this, it's sort of obvious to me that one side has captured an institution. And I think that's what you found on campuses. So, Charlie Kirk was saying there is an orthodoxy here, that you could basically poll people on campus on these sort of hot button issues like trans issues, abortion, gay marriage, and you would probably get a consensus, a very large consensus. Maybe some of that because of fear, because of the social pressure. People say, I don't know if I want to say that I'm against this thing because my friends might make my life very uncomfortable. So Charlie kind of created that space for disagreement. I mean, there's many things that Charlie believed fervently that I just don't. But you have to accept that the guy was very good at marshalling evidence and engaging with his opponents.
Yeah, there's actually quite a lot you said there that I think is quite important to actually unpack, because again, it comes down to this idea of a liberal education. So classically liberal. I don't want to say we have to be very specific, because there's this idea that there's this classical liberalism, and then there's also the idea of what we now class as progressivism, which is like progressivism with the modern idea of being liberal now means to be progressive. It's not actually classically liberal. What it means is to be progressive. I am not a progressivist, just to be clear. Right, so coming back, the idea now of the orthodoxy of the universities, we have to remind ourselves of the Critique of the Church Authority, 1517, by Martin Luther in his 97 Theses. And he wrote what he subsequently talked about the two kingdoms. There was the spiritual kingdom, which is church, preaching, faith, conscience, and then there was the temporal kingdom, the kingdom of the civic government, law, education. And he said that the two had to be distinct. They had to be distinct, but effectively they would be intertwined, but only through the conscience of the individual. So he said that the state could not control souls, and the church could not control worldly institutions. So he effectively said that you couldn't enforce religious orthodoxy. And that whole idea of the inability of the state to enforce orthodoxy was effectively what caused the Enlightenment, the classical liberal revolution, if you want to call it that, in the first place. Now, why I'm saying this is important is that the very first place where the state always had the purview of indoctrination for the orthodoxy was in the educational establishments, the universities. And Martin Luther said very clearly, the state's purview was not to enforce the religious orthodoxy. He said that it wasn't a social good. And so for him, he had this idea that was later expanded by John Locke and Wilhelm and many other philosophers, and that was universities had to become secular institutions. They had to be separate from the state's orthodoxy. They had to be separate from church and state. That's where the ideas come from. And what's really interesting about that is that the universities were then required to be so distinctly separate that the universities were allowed to challenge the orthodoxy of the church. And that's how you had this idea of progressing, right? But now, what's interesting is that the Enlightenment seems to have ceased. We've stopped the Enlightenment. We've gone back to a medieval position where the universities are no longer positions of challenging, they are positions of indoctrination. They are reinforcing the state orthodoxy. And the issue that you have there of Palestine is a fantastic example of enforcing the doctrine or the state-approved doctrine. Because let's be honest, Durko and the ANC government's position is that Palestine good, Israel bad. The end. No questions asked. Now, if we use Martin Luther's idea, the universities would critique that doctrine by providing dissenting voices. And that way, you could have dissenting voices with the normal voices of the orthodoxy, and we could maybe progress. And we could actually get to a better form of understanding. In other words, we could have a form of enlightenment. We don't have that anymore, dude. What we have is we have dogmatic enforcement. We have orthodox enforcement by the universities, and that ultimately was what Charlie Kirk was trying to show. He wanted to show that. He wrote a whole book on this. Not many people know that, but he actually wrote a book around why he said colleges are a scam. Because he said that colleges, your kid would go to a college as a normal, ordinary child and would become indoctrinated into the state orthodoxy. And the reason the killer of Charlie Kirk was so important is because he effectively proved Charlie Kirk right. This was a kid that came from a normal Republican household, one term, one semester in a liberal education in these universities, in a college, and he became radicalized. Everything that Charlie Kirk preached, 100% correct. He proved it himself. Unfortunately, it cost him his life, but he did prove his thesis 100% correct.
Yeah, there's a sense in which universities have kind of abandoned their project. I mean, when I've seen Kirk debates on this, he said, well, just from an economic perspective, we think about any kind of financial scam. You say, all right, if I'm going to put money into this thing, am I going to reap a return? He says, all right, let's put out medicine and law and engineering, where you're actually learning a sort of difficult skill. And let's just look at the humanities. He says, basically, it costs you in the States, it's like unfathomable sums, like $100,000 a year. So you take on all this debt. I often think you come out a dumber person because you end up reading stuff that's its own strange coded language. I run a philosophy show, but we're an analytic philosophy show. So it's all about clarity. How do we understand this thing? How do we sort of make progress through argumentation as opposed to how do we use bullshit to baffle brains? So a lot of continental philosophy is just hocus pocus and deeply ideological. So, you have this idea of, there's really the oppressors and the oppressed in the world, and you need to be part of the good class. You need to, do a bit of self-flagellation because you're probably born into some sort of privileged class. Obviously, you went to a university with $100,000 a year, so you better start atoning. But don't worry, if you give, the cash to the cult, we'll exonerate you, and you have the right terms for the dinner parties, and everybody will think you're fantastic. It's a little bit of a kind of extreme champagne socialism. What is interesting, though, is that what the universities used to do is kind of being done in other areas. So, the fact that I've interviewed something like 250 academic philosophers from around the world, and a lot of them have said to me privately, the kind of conversation they can have on my show is not a conversation they can have on their campus. But there's a sense of community. People really will engage with the ideas. We'll have people on with really bizarro stuff, but they'll provide very good arguments for it. We'll always, rebuff them. We'll try and understand the position. But we're not alone. I mean, you've got so many amazing YouTube shows and podcasts out there that are about exploring the realm of ideas. And in a way, if you're a curious person, you live in a golden era for information. And it's not clear that universities kind of give you the thing that they promised to give you before, which is, as you say, a classical liberal education, which enables you to be a good citizen and sort of be curious and understand the world well. It seems that what it does is give you a credential. It's sort of like being a country club member if you went to Harvard, as opposed to, you've become this deep, thoughtful person.
I'm in agreement with that, and it's very interesting that you mention what you do, because I'm always reminded of one of my favorite quotes, and it's from the South African-born Elon Musk. And he says, I hate when people confuse education with intelligence. You can have a doctor's degree and still be an idiot. And it's 100% true. But there is this idea that obviously they go to university, and that somehow means that they're very educated individuals. I've heard Charlie Kirk ask many individuals during his debates what the actual university degree itself meant. They said, well, it meant that I could see something through to the end. And he said, well, you could do that anyways. You could go for a run and see it through to the end, and that would show me that. Like, university education didn't actually show it to you. And what ultimately it actually meant is that you could get to the end of your course and show that you had consumed the relevant amount of, state indoctrination. In other words, you had got all the right talking points. And he proved that because the amount of university professors that would actually pass an individual who submitted theses with alternative views to that which the professor himself held were actually very low. Because if you did submit something like that, you would effectively be failed. But it's something that I've recently talked on myself, this idea of, a classical education and the books involved. I don't know if you know, but until 1957, they used to actually publish this as a set of books. And the actual books themselves was like the must thing that you needed in your home. I've actually managed to go find myself an old set. So I actually have a set of it. It's, by the way, just as a complete tangent off side note, it's kind of like an encyclopedia. Every home used to have an encyclopedia, but now nobody has an encyclopedia. So very interestingly, I also went to go find a set of encyclopedias for my house, and I have that in my house as well. But the last set of encyclopedias made were like in 1991. Like, nobody buys them anymore. You actually can't buy an updated encyclopedia, by the way. But it's really curious as to what that classical education actually involved. As you know, it would have included things like Homer, Plato, Aristotle, Virgil. You would have obviously had the Bible. You would have had Thomas Aquinas. You would have had John Locke, John Milton, Shakespeare. Adam Smith, the founder, obviously, Wealth of Nations. That's the idea where we get capitalism from. The only real kind of classical liberal education that you find anybody still kind of has is anything from Karl Marx and Engels, Communist Manifesto. It's pretty much it. Like, everybody else is like, nah. Francis Bacon, nah. Rene Descartes, no. Like, that's old people language. Like, that's not for me. Let's all talk about the proletariat, and a book that was actually very limited in time in terms of its applicability, which actually doesn't apply that much anymore because the world is grossly different to anything Karl Marx wrote about. And yet, all the actual philosophers that we should know or speak of, no one speaks of anymore because they have no reasons. Like, that's kind of what's happened. So this idea of actually having any form of classical liberal thought, for me, it's impossible. But it's impossible because people don't have the foundational aspects in order to have those conversations.
Yeah, I mean, there's a sense in which having a collective treasure of humanity where people are reading from the great books, watching the great films, allows for a level of open communication. I was at a good friend's 40th birthday, and during his speech, he read out from the Iliad. And he sort of said, like, it turns out that the first poem was also the greatest poem. And there's a lot that you can learn from those classical sources. And the advantage of those sort of sources as well is that if everybody was reading them, then you can have a shorthand for understanding each other. And a lot of those stories around going out into battle, fighting for your nation, returning to your family. Like, I read an interesting article about the Iliad being taught at Israeli universities, and how it's just had a very different impact on the soldiers who've gone and read the book and gone into battle, and how their loved ones have felt reading the book as well. And it's amazing that you can have a piece of literature that's thousands of years old that still has that impact. There is a sense, it sort of occurred to me, that it's very rare that I'm at a dinner party and someone says, you have to read this book. When I was younger, it definitely felt like literature was a living art form, and we were all reading, a certain set of books. Uh, and maybe it's not even go and watch this movie or watch this TV show. It's go and watch this YouTube channel. So maybe I'm okay with that. um, but
If it's
yeah,
yours, right?
yeah. It's funny. So
Otherwise,
like,
no.
I mean, in South Africa, if anyone knows me for Brain Navat, I'm always absolutely delighted. I got interviewed on TV, and I mean, people know me for the kind of Malema case and the legal work. And the host said to me just before we started recording, said, "Oh, I'm a big Brain Navat fan," and I was kind of wowed by it. But in the States, in the philosophy departments, we're very well known. And most of our viewership's in America. But there's also a sense in which, look, philosophy is an arcane thing, but it's a beautiful treasure. It helps you uncover the deep things in the world. Think about theories of right action. What is it to be a good person? How do you adjudicate different political disputes? What is the nature of reality? Is there a God? Like, those things are important. I also worry that we kind of like. I think you're right to cast some of the blame on the killer on current education, but part of it seems to be like bad brain rot stuff, right? So guys kind of getting sucked down 4chan and Reddit rabbit holes, and being fed like lots and lots of short content. I sort of have this feeling that like if all you're watching are 40-second TikTok videos that are designed to be like pure candy, they kind of intercept past your logical brain and they instill these very strong feelings. And I also think that some of that stuff is state propaganda, just not the American state. Like, it seemed to be that the Chinese have done a very good job of poisoning young minds with TikToks outside of China, because in China you get like all the kind of wholesome dance videos, and you don't get a bunch of like pro-Hamas propaganda.
No, and it's very interesting that, obviously the Chinese invented TikTok, but were one of the first to ban it. It also strikes me as to be really relevant that Mark Zuckerberg, the founder of Facebook, banned his children from being on Facebook.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing in a way that I think social media was an experiment that lasted 20 years that has kind of come to an end. If I spend any time on Facebook nowadays, it's not seeing my friends post anything. It's basically groups and ads and things like that. I think people have kind of learnt from the cancel culture and from being burnt that actually, sharing your private life with a bunch of strangers is not a great idea. Some people are more likely to do it in private conversations on WhatsApp. But the truly
People have
social
also come
media,
to the understanding that social media is not real, right? So I'll put photos on there and I'll make my life look wonderful. Look at this and this and this. And then obviously you get the whole idea of like, people get jealous about your life. And they're like, oh, look at that life. Oh, it's so much better than mine. Next week you find out that guy's got like 3 affairs against his wife and he's getting divorced. And you're like, I didn't see that coming. I thought he was a happy family man. Like, we've all seen that. And so I think people are kind of like, I think now when they see that stuff online, they're just like, oh, pretentious, whatever. So people don't go looking for it.
yeah. I suppose what you have now is this sort of strange parasocial thing. So, you become a devotee of a certain kind of influencer and you watch all their stuff and you have the sense of a relationship with them, but they don't know who you are. And they might describe you in very like loyal terms, like, "Oh, my followers are doing this amazing stuff for me, and we're so appreciative." And it gives you that sense of a friendship. I do worry that we spend way too much time online, and I try and spend a lot of time, reading and talking with people, and I feel like that's going to be better for your brain.
Yeah, look, it's I'm not a fan of social media. Look, I use social media quite a lot more than I wish it did, but I don't actually use it that much. But I'll be honest and say I only use it for news, because obviously I have a show around news, right? So I could find the news. And I need to find as many sources of the news as possible in order to almost like aggregate it and then try come out with a coherent narrative. Because I try not to just use, say, News 24, because otherwise you just land up as being a summary of News 24. So I try to use as many sources and try like amalgamate and then try kind of figure out what's going on. I
Sure.
use social media for the
Like
exact same thing.
this segment is sponsored by Ground News. Every single video I've seen lately is like sponsored by Ground News. If you want to hear the whole story,
Yeah.
make sure you use Ground News.
Yeah, and you know what I mean. So, and no, I don't use ground news, and that in itself, actually, I think ground news also has its problems. But that's the only reason I actually use social media anymore. But then, a big problem now we have with social media as well, and especially with short form TikToks, is that it's very easy to say something as being very authoritative. I don't know, when I many moons ago when I did my MBA, there's a whole theory in MBAs around work-based psychology, right? And one of the key studies that was done in a work-based psychology, and I don't know if you've heard of it in the past, is it's what they basically call the clipboard theory. You know, the clipboard theory is if you walk around an office with a clipboard and you look like you're busy, most people will leave you alone. It's just like a work-based. They've done full studies on this. Random people walk around an office. They've got a clipboard and some paper in their hands, and like people are like, "Oh, fast, busy at work," and you're like, "Busy doing what?" Nobody challenges it. So there's another theory that goes on about that, and that is when challenged, if you are accidentally challenged with the clipboard theory, if you can give an answer with enough conviction, nobody will question it. So they could say, "What you doing, bud?" And you'd be like, taking consensus, which doesn't mean anything. It actually doesn't mean anything. But it sounds like, sounds technical. People will leave you alone and be like, "Okay, carry on." Consensus of what? Like, what are you doing? Asking coffee or what? Like, you could clearly ask, but nobody does. And I think that the same thing happens on TikTok, right? You got people with the clipboard showing you that somehow they know something, and they're saying things with enough conviction that most people go, "Well, must be right." Yeah, leave them alone. 100% correct. And you see the exact same things in so many different TikToks. It's like a 30-second clip. This is happening over here. The end. Like, okay. You're seeing right now Charlie Kirk, right? Charlie Kirk's a racist because he said this one time. Out of cut context, post a clip and you just go, "See, this shows he's racist." Nobody questions it, dude. Context is gone. Investigation is for other people.
Yeah. The worry is that sort of people don't like eating their vegetables, right? So I try and stay away from very breaking news, often because it's incorrect, often because it's sort of it's going to be irrelevant, in 6 weeks from now. So I prefer long form stuff. I find Quillette one of the gold standards on this. So you could have someone writing, a very long piece on a topic, often about free speech in academia, with lots of evidence, well researched, that captures a trend. There's also a sense in which our perception of reality kind of gets warped by the current. So people often have a sense of everything is terrible all the time, because you've got so many bits of evidence for that, often emotional bits of evidence for it, like the TikToker kind of screaming and, "Oh my God, this is so bad." But if you look at the kind of long form studies, generally the metrics are things are getting better. You have movements away from that, and there are moments of like extreme polarization that worry me. But generally, like, life expectancy goes up. Standards of living go up. We lift more and more people out of poverty all the time. We have less war, less suffering. But it's kind of hard to remind yourself of that because it's a long-term study. It's also people are like terrible at stats. So most people are kind of innumerate and really just don't understand, long-term trends. They're much more likely to respond to something immediate. They don't have good comparators. So, like, if I think about a lot of discussions I've had about the war in Gaza, for example, people will say, "It's so terrible how many people have died. Like, this is clear evidence for genocide." And I'd say, "Okay, so did you go and look at other and sort of look at, what the casualty ratios are like?" And they're like, "Never occurred to me to do that." Like, well, you have to try and get a sense of, is this all killing is bad, every innocent person that dies is bad, but how does it look in comparison to other conflicts where you weren't screaming genocide? And in the Israel case, for example, your civilians to militant casualty ratio is about 2-1, whereas in Mosul, in Afghanistan, it was about 4-1. So it becomes, once you kind of get a little bit of a sense of how numbers work, and you have
numbers are for plebs, bud. I mean, I'm sure you saw the note. There was 380. This is a genuine stat, by the way. I'm not even making this up. You can go check this yourself. The UN told me that 380,000 children were dying in Gaza, even though 340,000 live there. So 40,000 more children that even live there are dying in Gaza. Didn't you know that? You may want to question the numbers, but Numbers are for
Something
chumps, dude.
something interesting. So Navi Pillay headed up that commission, that recent UN report that makes a finding of genocide. I went to a talk that she gave very soon after October 7th, where at the time she said, um, it's such a shame that the law is what it is because we won't be able to hold Israel liable for genocide based on this legal test. We won't be able to prove data specialis. So we need to try and change the law. So you have someone who has like a very strong agenda, a strong interest in not just saying, well, what are the legal principles, what are the facts, let's make a determination. It's in an outcome, and has managed to, create a report that creates an outcome. In parallel to, of course, the judicial one that's going on before the ICJ.
So the problem is that all of these people have kind of determined the outcome and then kind of tried to fabricate the evidence in order to justify it. Once
Yes.
upon a time, people were smarter than that, and I thought that's the whole thing from post World War II type ideas, right? We no longer wanted to be in a situation where we came up with an idea and then justified it. We wanted to create justifications and then actually come up with what the conclusion was after we heard all the evidence. That was the whole point of the modern era, but it's not where we are now.
And it's not just in terms of fact finding. I mean, I think it's in terms of all sorts of things, like our discussion about free speech. I think there's certain people who care about that principle in the abstract, and other people who care about winning. And so, if you can own the other side, then you can abandon your commitment to free speech because it suits you in that moment. And it does feel like we kind of have less and less principled discussion nowadays. I mean, if you think about the Republican Party as a movement, I mean, many of the things that were held as pretty sacred, have been jettisoned. So, like the idea that they would be the party of tariffs, would have been like completely anathema to like 1980s Republicans. That they would have the unions backing them, for example. I mean, there's a commentator called Bacha Sunga Angar, who's a self-described Marxist and pro-Trump supporter. She says, Trump's as far left as you could like, very pro-unions, anti-immigration, pro-worker. She's like, it's a Marxist fantasy, which is really interesting. It's not exactly like the mainstream view on it, but it does feel like, often party positions can sort of shift. And if you think about the kind of Orwellian front on it, the line is, but it's always been this way. Oceania has always been our immortal enemy, and we've always been in love with, Eurasia.
Look, I think a big problem that we have now in modern discussions is the need to be, should we say, maybe the overused word would be things like virtue signaling. But I think it's this idea of not really having any form of credibility as a people, full stop, anymore. And so there's this idea of trying to, the Americans have it as almost this idea of stolen valor. Like, I have no valor. I have no intrinsic valor in myself. Ergo, I need to steal someone else's valor and their cause in order to make me seem more virtuous, And there's a really good example of this, and I don't know if you saw it today, but there's a news story that came out today of an Arizona professor who's nominated a Palestinian girl who died in the Gaza war to receive a Nobel Peace Prize. So her death's meant to show that there's somehow a genocide going on and we're going to nominate her for a Peace Prize. And what, we clap for this professor in his complete twaddle? So you have to ask yourself a question. Why did this professor in the United States in Arizona feel that this person was so justified? That's not to say that her death isn't tragic. As you said, every death is tragic. Like, we're not celebrating the deaths of anyone. But why is it that this professor feels the need to almost steal this girl's valor? To the point where, he wants to be in the headlines for nominating her for a Peace Prize, because we all know it's ridiculous. She didn't do anything. She died. That's it. She wasn't a choice. I'm pretty sure if you asked her if she wanted to die, she'd say no. So now we're going to steal her achievement, even though it's not really an achievement. It's not something that she would have wanted. And we're going to nominate her for a Peace Prize on the basis of what? Now that we've got that, we have to say, okay, now that I've stolen your virtue, what do I use your virtue for? Well, we really, really should free Palestine. Okay, cool. Let's expand that. Where is Palestine? Who's going to govern it? What's the city? What's the major cities? What's the capital? What does that mean in terms of, borders? Because, a big thing that you have at the moment, I mean, I'm sure you yourself understand this. There's a huge question around Israel allowing aid into Gaza. Any sovereign state has borders. We don't allow free movement between sovereign states. So who says Israel has to allow anybody through their borders? They can keep that border as shut as they want. Same as Poland can lock its borders up. You don't have to allow people to come into your territory. There's no law that says that in the state, in anywhere in the world. And if they really wanted stuff, they go to their other borders, like the one they got with Egypt. They could get stuff from there. Israel doesn't have to open up its borders. Because remember, it's a sovereign state. It's the Palestinian state. You guys told me that. It's a sovereign state. Well, if a sovereign state, Israel don't have to open up its borders to anybody. They lock that up as tight as they come. Right? So there's a lot of stupidity that goes in these. But nobody wants to have those conversations because those conversations are difficult. Much easier just to steal a dead girl's valor, right? And then I can just make myself seem so virtuous. Because, I dare to suggest the impossible if that's how they'll view it. It's dumb, dude. I've never seen this before. I cannot think of a time in history where this has ever happened before. And coming back to it, you may say to me, why? I'll blame social media. And I'll also blame the news cycles because something that happened with the first, the Bush invasion of Iraq is we had the invention of the 24 news hours. The news cycle, 24/7 news cycle. You never had that before. Never happened. And prior until George Bush's invasion of Iraq, and then everybody got to see a war in real time, blasted over the TV, and they were like, "Wow, it's amazing!" And then it just became kind of like the norm. Now, everybody wants to be the first to break stuff. Everybody wants to sensationalize things. Everybody wants to just plaster the complete garbage all over the news. But then in the process of doing that, you get the Netflix scenario. You've got so much choice that eventually I spend most of my time looking through Netflix to see what to watch, and then I decide not to watch anything because it's too much choice. And that's actually, I think, what happens here. There's so much going on that people just are like, can't be bothered. So then they got to do stupid shit like this. Well, this isn't helpful. None of this is helpful. It's stupid. And it's going to radicalize people. And would you know it? It did. It radicalized Charlie Kirk's killer. What's your view?
Yeah, it is interesting if you think about how you could care about a good cause and you might be very good at championing the cause, but that the championing doesn't help achieve anything useful. So a kind of a good example of this in 2016, there was this campaign to make Coney famous, who was this sort of warlord. And the guy who ran the campaign, made a whole bunch of Obama-style posters of Coney and wanted to try and draw attention to it, and eventually kind of drove himself mad. I think he wound up footage of him in the street, sort of losing his mind. And you think about a lot of climate activists, there's this sort of sense of going, the whole world is going to fall apart. We've only got 12 years left. We need to take extreme action. We need to blockade roads. We need to throw soup on Van Goghs. It's not clear that they're doing anything that's efficacious. If you care about ending hostilities in Israel and Gaza, right? There's actually a pretty simple solution, which is nations call on Hamas to lay down their arms, which the Arab states actually have done, and to hand over the hostages. You will immediately have peace. The war is not popular in Israel. There's a huge desire to bring the hostages home, a huge desire to not have the threat of Hamas perform another October 7th. But when you have various high-ranking states like the UK and Australia, Portugal, sort of recognizing Palestinian state, you say, well, what benefit will you get? Does this mix up with any of the other ordinary accounts of statehood that we have? As you mentioned, when we think of a state, we think of it as a stable government, as a particular territory. To my mind, the sort of talk of a two-state solution has been a bit crazy for a long time. The Gaza and the West Bank are pretty far from each other, run by two different governments who hate each other. Fatah were in power in Gaza, and they were killed by Hamas. They were thrown off buildings. So this idea that you've got this one unified
And the
force.
West Bank did have Jordan who was overseeing it, and Jordan had the same experience, and so said, "Screw this, you guys are on your own." So both states, if you want to call them that, have had that experience prior. That's why the West Bank and Gaza, to a degree, are not really governed by anybody. Like, Egypt was offered Gaza by Israel, and Egypt were like, nah, not for us. Jordan had a whole peace deal with Israel, land for peace, 1970s. They were like, yeah, have the West Bank. And the Jordanians were like, no, not for us. That wasn't because they were virtuous individuals. They felt the territories were ungovernable. There is a massive distinction. And let's be honest, they haven't got less ungovernable. They've got more ungovernable.
It's like they've been governed by Ibrahim Rasool. His policy was to
Pretty
make
much, yeah.
the Western Cape ungovernable when the DA got some power there.
100%.
Yeah, it's a sort of a sad situation, but as you say, there's this idea of there's a mismatch between people's feelings and being able to achieve something that's worthwhile. And I think a lot of people have a lot of love to give and they're caring, but they're very bad at evaluating evidence. And it's kind of an interesting problem in persuasion is that, you could all agree what a good outcome would be, but there'll be lots of disagreement about the methodology. A lot of people, let's say, care more about the fanfare than about the product. I mean, for example, if you're a greenie, one of the things that's really good for like stopping massive amounts of environmental deaths is moving to nuclear. So like a lot of people die from coal pollution. Almost no one dies from nuclear. But when someone does die from nuclear, it's sort of very vivid. So we think about Fukushima and we think about the other disasters, and we go like, that feels so catastrophic, like we can't allow that stuff. So the Germans then go and like scale back on all their nuclear, which ends up making them reliant on Russian gas, which makes it much harder to sort of push back against an avaricious Putin. So like if you don't think through the consequences of the consequences and you do stuff that feels good, you're going to wind up with some like terrible policy. And I think that's all over the show.
I'm in complete agreement. Complete agreement. But it's so curious to see how this is all kind of like progressing globally. Because it's all just... It's the ability for individuals to reason from a principled position now is non-existent. And I can only put that down to... I'm sure many individuals would disagree with me, but I would put it down to the lack of religiosity in the households. Most individuals traditionally would have had a principle that they would have learned from their parents, and they would have had it as a position that they inherited from their community as a whole. I'm going to talk about Anglo communities more than any others because I think Anglo communities, English-speaking communities, are probably the worst for this. But like I don't know. Maybe it's different in Afrikaans households. Don't know. I'm not an Afrikaner, so I can't speak. But like, you find this using the Jewish households as an example. Jewish households are brought up with a distinct idea of who they are. They all know they're Jewish. They knew that from like day dot. They all grew up with this Seder. You have a Seder in April. Too much fried food at Hanukkah at the end of the year. Too much sweet food during Rosh Hashanah. Like, you also know maybe you go to church relatively frequently or not, but let's be honest, like your mom lights candles. You know your place in history, right? You've seen your mom light Shabbat candles, even if you weren't overly observant. But you had a distinct idea of who you were. So if at later points in your life you want to expand that and you want to do more with it, well, you can, because you have the basic foundational aspects, right? You know roughly who you are. Don't find that in Anglo households, dude. Like what you find in Anglo households is like everybody is brought up with the idea of being a consumer. Go to school, get good grades, get a good job so you can buy a good house, and you can buy lots of cheap shit that you don't want. That's the highlights of your life. And you find this, like you watch Anglos immigrate, and I know I get a lot of slack for this, and I've talked about this topic way too much, but You watch Anglos immigrate. Oh, it's because my kids will have a better future. Define better future. Oh, well, they'll have a better job. See, like what's the measure of success in an Anglo household? A good job, so I can get a good income to buy more cheap shit that I don't need. What's your place in history? I don't know. Who cares? History? Well, what's that? That's for plebs. And that has problems because even from a point of principle, like when it comes through to imposing principles or ideas, because I don't know who I am, I'm more than welcome to abide by your principle and ideas because they seem just as good as anybody else's. It's not like I have any of my own to kind of like piggyback on the back of, so I don't have a counterweight. You can give me whatever you want. I'll just swallow it and be like, it's fine. You're right there.
Yeah, so I think you're right that one of the great modern malaise is that people value the wrong things in life. So, like dedicating your life towards things that are actually worthwhile is a difficult task because you've got to ask these deep questions like what actually matters. As you say, like ceaselessly buying stuff that you're not going to care about doesn't feel like a particularly good way to kind of deal with the crisis of existence. I sort of think that searching for the true, the beautiful, and the good is something that people should be focused on. And so, as you say, like doing meaningful work, having strong social relationships, making things that are beautiful, those are worthwhile. It's probably one of the reasons why you like South Africa. There's like a challenge here. There's a ruggedness. There's a capacity to kind of make change in a way that if you were I don't know living in Northern Europe, working in a good job, it'd be kind of dull.
Yeah, but I think even that idea, like of being in Northern Europe and doing a good job, I think that becomes problematic now because it's like, okay, is that the crux of my criteria for success, right? Living in Northern Europe and having a good job. You can say, well, at least you're European in a European state. Well, that's no longer the case. England's a really good example. You can't be English in an English state because that would be classed as racist. Like, this is true. We know this. Like, just go look at the flag, the whole flag issue that's going on there at the moment. You raise a flag that's deemed to be racist. You know, all the foreigners there are telling you that you can't be English or European in your own country because the idea of being European is distinctly racist or somehow negative. So, what can you be? Well, you can be a good worker bee, a good economic unit. You can earn a good salary and buy lots of useless junk that you don't need. Like that's the measure of success, dude. Like that's it. Like that's it. Like they don't encourage entrepreneurs. They don't encourage independent thought. They don't encourage creativity. It's like just be a good economic unit. What more do you want?
Yeah, as you say, like if you're sort of on your deathbed and you're reflecting on, how much of a good corporate worker bee you were, feels like a little bit grim. Um,
I've seen it in my own family, man. Like I've said this actually once before. You know, my brother's a prime example of this. You know, he's just got married. His wife is like 40, 45. She says she wants kids, but she's desperate to complete her PhD, and that may mean that she never actually gets to have kids. And so, that's cool. But she's a doctor, and she's got a really good education, and she's building up a property portfolio. And all I say to that is, what a load of shit! Like, who are you going to hand this off to? You've got no kids. You can be worth $1 trillion. That money's going where? It's going nowhere. There's no legacy here. At the end of your life, are you going to sit in your bed going, "Oh, I've lived a good life. I wrote a doctorate that nobody will ever read ever again and not give a flying shit about." Like, is that really the measure of your success? That you, on your tombstone, because let's face it, these days it's not even tombstones because you're probably going to get cremated. So on your cremation box, are they going to put like Doctor So and So, and that's going to be like, my life was worth it? Like, come on, man, where's the priorities here?
yeah, and especially if you're chasing the credential as opposed to the knowledge. If I think about, I spend a lot of time with academics. Very few of them look back on their PhD as being like a worthwhile endeavor. It was a thing to be done
It's
so they
not.
could kind of keep doing the work that they do for a job,
Mm,
basically, and a job that doesn't pay very
mm,
well. Like, academics in the States kind of earn fine, but not great. Um, and a lot of the stuff that they're writing about is, as you say, read by almost no one. You've got this very scammy industry there where like most articles produced in the humanities are read by, the author and their mom, and that's about it. And the mom probably gave up after the third time she got sent an article. So you're not even like furthering human knowledge.
I know. But you can't further human knowledge because, as you know, like even these days, any form of furthering of human knowledge is just going to be like some obscure bullshit comments about, I don't know, gender studies, gender fluidity in peacock birds. Ooh, I feel enriched. Like they're not groundbreaking scientific studies. Like they're complete garbage. Gender fluidity in credit card psychology. Don't know about you, but my credit card's a piece of plastic. I don't think about nothing. But it's like I'm sure that's probably a PhD for someone. Like, is this seriously what you think is this? Dude, you better off just spending your time reading bloody manga. Spend your life reading manga. It'll be a lot happier for you. Like, just as expensive, but at least you'll have something to show for it. You'll have a good working knowledge of Naruto, and that's probably, let's be honest, more people are going to read your subreddit on Naruto's feelings around Sasuke or something, and that's going to be far more, enjoyable for more people to read than anybody or anything you produce out of your bloody PhD. You know what I mean?
I mean, one way to check whether it's worthwhile is if you had to ask people before they've gone to university, what do you imagine that you would write, as a doctoral thesis? I think very few people would guess the sort of stuff that's coming out of universities. In a way, it is like this strange cult where you arrive, they tell you everything that you're taught is totally wrong. You need to be deprogrammed, you need to learn the new language, the new pronouns, the new, in fashion thinkers. And then you're going to write this thing for 8 years of your life that almost no one will care about. Not even your peers will care about.
Not even you will care about.
Yeah,
It's like you'll write this thing, you'll put it on a shelf, and that's it. And like you never look at it again. Even you won't care.
Also, I feel like I was lucky in that I went to UCT at a kind of golden era when there really was an openness. And both my philosophy thesis and LLB thesis are things that I draw on all the time. But I think those sort of days are kind of few and far between now for academics.
Yeah, I don't know, man. The educational establishment is problematic, and I don't see this as the ways going forward as being really sustainable. I think that if you look now online, there's a growing movement for people to reclaim this idea of classical liberal education. Well, that's very easy to obtain. Pick up a book and read it at home. Like, we live in this amazing time where you can be the smartest person who ever walked the planet because you have a permanent encyclopedia in your pocket. You can literally look up anything in the entire planet. And you know what? If you really don't want to read thousands and thousands of pages of literature, load ChatGPT and ask it to summarize it for you. There's loads of ways for you to learn stuff these days in ways that you never could before. What's the number one thing people use their phones for? Cat videos. It's the most watched thing on a phone. Cat videos. So you could literally be the smartest person to ever walk the planet right now, but you spend your time watching cat videos.
Yeah, it's a time of great abundance and great squandering of resources, I suppose.
Anyway, bud, I think we've been on here for an hour talking complete nonsense. So lovely to chat with you. Do let us know what you think in the comment section below. If you like my good friend Mark, like, and you want us to do more shows together, you put a comment in the comment section just saying like more of you two, and we'll get more of Mark on the show because he's a great conversationist.
Excellent. Well, thanks for having me on. And if you want to see my take on Charlie Kirk, Brandon Navac did a video on it a few days after the assassination. And we do all sorts of weird and wonderful things on the show.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, man. And happy Rosh Hashanah.
You too.
Take it easy, man.
Ciao.